of step up, please, this is the opportunity to get those things resolved. So Nikki, I will turn it over to you, and appreciate all you do.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll just start going through the slides that we've prepared today for our meeting around permanent supportive housing at River Ford Parkway. So I think as staff, one of the things that we have recognized is that we're at a crossroads with respect to the Ramada property. As many of you know, the city entered into a purchase and sales contract earlier in the year and explored the potential for an emergency shelter on site. It became evident that that was not going to work out for that site. We heard from our funding partners as well as from the members of the community that more planning was needed to really enable us to develop an emergency shelter that would meet the needs of our community, but also be a shelter that would be sustainable over time. That takes a lot of commitment from the city, from our funding partners, from the community, a funding commitment as well. And so we want to do that right. And so we wanted to recognize that and to acknowledge that more planning is needed. But as Deborah mentioned, we are committed to that end because we know that is a need in our community. And you'll be seeing further along in the slides how we look at the issue of homelessness and how we seek to address that issue through a systems approach, a really smart approach to understand how we work on solving that issue and meeting the needs of our greater community. But really, what we learned is that we weren't ready and that we needed to reinitiate a planning process. But we still have a real estate contract. And so that contract expires December 15th. And that means that the city must give notice that we're either going to withdraw our contract or proceed. And so with the partners in the community, not ready really to commit to those purchase and operations, we went forward with the decision to pursue a planning process instead. As staff, we really tried to look at things, look at the situation, look at the landscape, and try to understand what goals that we could accomplish. We've built so much sharing of information. There's been so much sharing of information with the community around this that we wanted to try to understand if there was a win-win possible. And so we developed these three goals that we believed would meet us where we are, meet the community where we are, and meet a potential development company with an opportunity to look at a permanent supportive housing. So those are the three goals that we want to put forward tonight. Is that goal one, we want to continue to work with our funding partners and with the community on a new consultant-led planning process for an emergency shelter in our community. We're holding true to that. Goal two, we will continue but wind down those shelter operations that are currently in place at the Ramada until March 31st, 2022, while working on housing solutions for each participant. But goal three is a handoff that real estate contract at the Ramada to a private entity nonprofit partnership so that a repurpose can happen. So that property can convert from a hotel use, as it is now, to a permanent supportive housing use to meet the need. So with that, what does that look like? So permanent supportive housing at Ramada looks like 50 units or better of permanent affordable housing for homeless veterans and 50 units of permanent affordable housing for chronically homeless individuals. You're going to hear more about that from Step Up later on in the presentation, and also how they provide on-site wraparound services to support those residents. So this is converting from a shelter use into a housing use, and that is what we'll hear more about later. The partners of this is number one, Shangri-La Industries. So how this works is that Shangri-La, they're a for-profit developer and general contractor. They would purchase the hotel and then renovate it into housing, and they would continue to own that property. So the city would no longer be in the position of purchasing that hotel or doing anything with it. We would basically assign that contract to Shangri-La, and that company would then buy the property, renovate it into housing, and then continue to own it in perpetuity for that use. And then they partner with Step Up on 2nd Street, who is here with us tonight, as a nonprofit housing provider that operates the project and then provides the on-site supportive services to residents. And this is based on a model that this partnership has used in other cities across our country. And we're really excited to learn more about how that has been successful for them and what lessons they have learned along the way. That funding model, which I think is really unique and really presents quite a great opportunity here for the city of Asheville, is that private funds, so not public funds, but entirely private capital, is used to purchase and renovate that hotel. And then federal housing vouchers, housing choice vouchers, as you may have heard them named in the community, that's what is used to really pay that ongoing carrying costs. It pays the rent, which covers that funding and covers the operational costs of the property itself. And then local funding is used to provide those step-up on-site supportive services, and that's currently estimated at $500,000 per year. So that's how that funding model operates. We just wanted to be clear and really share that so it's understood of what we're talking about and what kind of model is used here with this particular partner. And what we see here and what staff saw in our conversations with this group is that there were a lot of pros with how that could work as a potential option for that Ramada property. It's a strategic opportunity to meet a critical need for permanent supportive housing. It adds 100+ long-term affordable housing units to our community, and there's a high return on that public investment. What we're looking at with Step Up is to help fund those supportive services for a 3-year period, and they have asked for a $1.5 million grant of ARPA grant in public dollars to really support that. But we see that as a high return on investment, where if the city chooses to approve a $1.5 million grant application, that would then leverage private capital on the order of $10 million plus to see that hotel be converted into a permanent supportive housing use. But as Deborah said before, we recognize that this is a short turnaround time with little opportunity for public engagement. But again, I think we had wanted to see what was possible for this site that is, currently a hotel, right? Has been a hotel used for quite a number of years. And if not for this potential pivot, would likely continue to be a hotel for years to come. We wanted to take the opportunity to provide this option for city council members to review and look at. That will be coming up for vote next Tuesday night, the 14th, as an option for them to consider. And I think when I think about the pros and cons here, what's important to me is that in our community, we have a lot of housing service providers right now, a lot of providers that are trying to meet the need. And it's very evident to me that we need all of these providers coming together. It is such a deep need in our community for affordable housing that we've got to be prepared with looking at multiple different paths to get there. And we have to get there with our existing partners. I want to speak to the good work that Homeward Bound is doing right now, as well as Haywood Street. I know we've been working with them on a potential ask for affordable housing, but I truly believe that having more partners at the table can really help lift and really help meet the need of our affordable housing crisis in our community. So we welcome the opportunity to partner. We welcome the opportunity to onboard new partners to really help rise all ships. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian Husky, and he's going to help us really understand how this permanent supportive housing use really fits in with our housing crisis response system. So Brian, do you want to take it from here? And I'll be happy to forward slides as you need.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikki. So homelessness at its most basic level is a housing crisis. And so Asheville, as many communities are doing, is building out its housing crisis response system. And so the way we know how we can end homelessness is to house people. The most emergent need that a homeless person has is the lack of a safe, affordable place to live. And so by housing people who are experiencing homelessness as quickly as we possibly can, with no preconditions, and with the appropriate services wrapped around them to ensure that they remain housed, That's where we're trying to get in implementing additional permanent supportive housing units in the community. In terms of the overall crisis response system, there's multiple components of it, and Asheville already has a lot of these in place and a lot of it really great work already being done. We have excellent street outreach, some of which is funded by the city of Asheville itself. We have some other street outreach that we were fortunate to put in place with some of our community development block grant dollars and emergency solutions grant dollars that were COVID related. Prevention and diversion. Of course, we want to prevent homelessness whenever we can. And when someone presents as recently homeless as if we can figure out ways to divert them to other options besides entering the homeless services system, we want to do that when we can as well. Part of the entire system is coordinated entry, where we are prioritizing the most vulnerable people in the community to be housed first. And vulnerability is determined by a number of different factors, but it's typically folks who are unsheltered, have been homeless for extended periods of time, and have multiple conditions that place them at great risk if they remain on the streets, and at the highest risk of death the longer that they remain on the streets. We have, thanks to not only COVID-related money, but other federal dollars, a good system of rapid rehousing in place for folks that perhaps need a little bit less in terms of wraparound services and long-term rental assistance. But the thing that we are lacking in the community is an adequate supply of permanent supportive housing units. Fortunately, we have some underway with the city's support in partnership with the Dogwood Health Trust and Buncombe County for the acquisition of the Days Inn on Tunnel Road, which will produce 85 units of permanent supportive housing. But if you talk to our homeless services providers in the community who are working to get people from the streets and into housing, if you ask them what we need more of, without hesitation, they're going to tell you, we need more permanent supportive housing. As Nikki previously mentioned, and our city manager, Deborah Campbell, also mentioned, we are also committed to creating that low barrier emergency shelter in the community that's been a long missing gap in our continuum of services. So we're working on these two things simultaneously. We definitely need the shelter because we need to keep people alive, but until we can get them into housing. But we've got to get the housing in place so we can make sure that we have people that don't end up in the shelter for long, long periods of time. Next slide, please. Matthew Desmond, who wrote a really great book called Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. I love this quote. He says that a home is the wellspring of personhood. And if you look at Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think this is a great illustration of what Matthew Desmond is saying. If you don't have a safe place to call home, it's pretty hard to be part of a community. It's difficult to maintain self-esteem and dignity, to stay clean and healthy, and to be in a position stable enough where you can seek additional education or try to gain employment. And the things that many of us take for granted, having a place to go to the bathroom, to bathe, to be free from the potential to be victims of violent crime, these things we take for granted, and folks who do not have their foundational needs met, a place to call home where they can feel safe, it's really hard to have that sense of belonging to a community. And so the building block of having a safe place to live is just critical in helping to rebuild lives of folks who are exiting homelessness and into housing. Next slide, please. So what is permanent supportive housing? Well, it's really not unlike any other multifamily residential development. It targets a specific population, and it provides the right level of social services support to get tenants connected up to community resources based on their individual needs and aspirations and choices. Asheville's existing permanent supportive housing efforts by Homeward Bound and many others in the community, we have retention rates of better than 90% of folks that get housed, stay housed. The model in collaboration with Step Up, their retention rate is more like 97%. And I'll let Todd and Aaron speak to that here shortly. But once we have someone housed, the work begins to ensure that they stay housed. We want to get them housed and keep them housed. And those supportive services that are wrapped around folks, that's one of the primary intentions of those services, is to build the skills that are necessary for them to be able to remain stable tenancy. Next slide, please. So why permanent supportive housing? And why are we focusing on this now? It's been around in various forms for a long time. There's a critical shortage of it, not only here in Asheville, but in communities across the United States. So why do we want to implement this, more of it? I'll give you a handful of reasons. I could go on for a long time about this, but there's a large body of research that supports permanent housing using the Housing First model, 20 plus year body of research that demonstrates that getting people housed and getting them safe allows us to start then putting the services in place that can help them rebuild their lives and gain stability. Permanent supportive housing also reduces the need in the community for costly interventions that we know are non-productive. Interactions with the police department, interactions with the criminal justice system, hospitalizations, emergency room utilization. And so as we reimagine public safety here in Asheville, this providing permanent housing for folks that have frequent interactions with the police and the criminal justice system, housing is a vital piece of that reimagination of public safety in our community. Permanent supportive housing also enables people who have some significant disabilities to live stably in the community. And with the right support, they become part of the community. They join a community and become part of that community. Having a safe, stable place to live gives them the opportunity to do that. Consistent access to health care, it sort of relates to the second point. If you have consistent access to health care, primary health care, behavioral health care, will have better health outcomes for people who are housed rather than leaving them on the streets. And the last point that I really want to emphasize, that provision of permanent supportive housing, it's the most dignified and humane and logical response to homelessness, because it ends homelessness for the people who we get into housing. And it means longer lives, better health, and a chance to be part of the community. Todd, I'd like to turn it over to you and Aaron at this point, and let you tell us all about Step Up and all the good work that you've been doing and your interest in coming to Asheville and helping us and our community end homelessness here.
Thank you so much, Brian. And it's a pleasure to be here joining you today. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Step Up and also this project. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to cover primarily three topics. I want to give you a background about our organization, who STEP is, And then I want to talk about permanent supportive housing and motel conversions from a little bit of a broader context to give you a base of understanding. And then finally, the third topic I'll cover is to dive much deeper into the project, the Ramada project, and how that's going to work operationally. So let's get started. First, a little bit about our organization. Again, I'm Todd Lipka, and I've been the CEO and president for the past 20 years with Step Up. And Step Up is an organization we started in Santa Monica. We've been around since 1984, and we really started as a mental health organization. We have psychiatrists on staff and licensed clinical social workers. So we do a lot of clinical work, but we're really an organization that creates belonging. I love Brian's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that middle need was love and belonging. And this is what we're really trying to do with individuals who are disenfranchised. They've been on the street for years. So that's really our focus as an organization, is the individuals have been on what HUD defines as chronically homeless, which is a year or more of homelessness. But really, Step Up works with many people who have been homeless for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30. We've even worked with individuals who are homeless for 40 years. We place thousands of people in housing. So the Step Up organization is a national organization. We're in 4 states, of course, California, Florida, Tennessee, and Georgia, and we're looking forward to the prospect of being a solution in North Carolina as well. We have about 350 staff in our organization, and our budget is about $45 million per year. And we have right now 14 housing projects, all of them, as Brian talked about, permanent supportive housing projects, all individuals who've been on the streets for years. And some of them with a mental illness, some of them with a physical and mental illness, and a number with a mental illness and a substance abuse issue. So it's something we're very, very comfortable with. When we go into a new community, we want to talk with the community and find out who are the individuals who've been on the street the longest, who are the most problematic. You know, that the police know and are always seeing in the various systems of care that the government has that are very expensive, that Brian called out, the ER, the 911 calls, the jails and the courts, because those are the individuals that are the most expensive, the most problematic. But we also know that the model that we have is successful in housing those individuals and keeping them housed and have them reintegrate, as Brian talked about, into the community. And I want to go back and emphasize what Brian said. We look at retention rates as an organization, and that retention rate is defined as when we move somebody into housing from day one, we look a year later if that individual is still in housing. And I think Brian talked about a 90+% in Asheville. Across the country, 80 to 85% is about the norm, and Step Up has a 97% retention rate. And that's particularly special when you think about we're working with some of the most challenging individuals on the street. So we got into developing housing in the early 90s. We were a full-blown mental health organization. But we realized that for many of the people that we were serving, they were being left out. Nobody, private landlords, even affordable housing, they didn't want people who were homeless, and particularly people who were homeless who were struggling with complex issues. So we decided to get into the housing development business to provide the housing ourselves. So we've been doing this now for decades. And our first project came online in 1994 in Santa Monica. It's right in downtown Santa Monica next to the 3rd Street Promenade. So I just want you to know, as an aside, we're very familiar with destination communities like Asheville. We work in Santa Monica, we work in Beverly Hills, we work in Hollywood, we're doing a project in Orlando. So we're very familiar with the particular issues that destination cities like Asheville have. So we did a number of projects in the 90s and the 2000s, and Unfortunately, this model for developing housing, Brian talked about permanent supportive housing a lot, and that's the nomenclature, and he defined it well. But the system for developing this housing, which is pretty much funded by the government, is a very complex, cumbersome, and complicated system. These are very complex deals that end up costing a lot more than they should and end up taking a lot more time than they should. And I'll just give you the numbers for Los Angeles, some of the projects. And I hope you're sitting down as you listen to these numbers. And again, this is not Asheville, but just to give you an idea, in an expensive real estate community like Los Angeles, it literally takes 6 years to get these projects from day one until they open. And it costs about $600,000 per unit. And that's whether you do rehab or new construction. Step Up thought that was really insane. You could buy a house in many communities across this country at $600,000, and to take 6 years, people are going to die on the street. People who need this life-saving help of housing will pass away before you ever get these built. Or, as the case of Los Angeles, there'll be 10 times more homeless people by the time you finish construction on the project. So we really looked early on to innovate. How can we get housing online faster and less expensively? And we've been partnering with Shangri-La, which is a private company, and Step Up is a 501c3 nonprofit, to really find a solution to a better pathway to creating housing faster and less expensively. Now, this idea of permanent supportive housing, I just want to talk about that a little bit more. When you're talking about homeless individuals, particularly people who've been on the street the longest, if you give them housing but without services, they're going to fail because they need the support. They're going to fail because the reasons that they're on the street for so long, they don't have the skills to manage in the housing. But on the other hand, if you provide services without housing, you're simply maintaining somebody in a state of homelessness and never solving their fundamental problem. So I know a shelter is very important to the city of Asheville, but I want you to know that Step Up really doesn't ever do any kind of housing that's not permanent housing. And when we go into a community, we always have housing resources for all the people that we're going to serve, because we know without housing, that Maslow's hierarchy, you're still on the physiological level, you're still surviving day to day. And let me reassure you, we've housed thousands and thousands of people in our organization with decades of homelessness. Living on the street is a life of misery. There's no glamour to it. You spend 100% of your energy just surviving day to day. It's a humiliating, stigmatizing experience, and it's self-stigmatizing. And homeless people, particularly chronically homeless people, they want housing. Now, it may not appear that way, because if they're going to the bathroom in the bushes, or they're resistant to interventions, or they are angry, appear angry, or acting out, I can tell you our experience is that these individuals, it's because they've been disappointed so many times over so many years that they've essentially given up hope. So when we house individuals in a project like the Ramada Inn, we have these projects throughout California. We're about to do another probably 20 motel conversions over the next couple of years, in addition to the prospective Asheville project. But they all work very similar. We have projects I'll give you an example. We have actually one of the things I'm proudest of is a motel conversion we did in Hollywood. And this project is right near the corner of Hollywood and Vine, the famous intersection in Hollywood. This was a 1920s building, and we bought the building and converted it with Shangri-La into a permanent supportive housing project, 36 units. And we took individuals from the streets of Hollywood who had been chronically homeless, living on the streets for years, many of them with a serious mental illness. And the most amazing thing about this project is there's a preschool literally next door. And there's an elementary school literally 1 block away. And if you know anything about this field, the PTAs are probably going to be the most vocal opponents to having this kind of housing near a school. Well, not only were they not opponents, but both schools supported the project. And that's because we took individuals from that community and we made a commitment to the community. In fact, Step Up has a good neighbor agreement that I'll be sharing with you that really talks about how we're a good neighbor in every community that we're working with. So we're committed to being a good neighbor in Asheville, not only with the immediate neighbors of the shopping center, some of the residences, but with the provider community of homeless services and the entire resident community with you. And that's partly why I'm here today. And not only did the school support it, but the project opened in 2013. And we've been harmoniously living together since then without any real issues. And I know that may be a little jaw-dropping to you, but that is our reality. Homeless individuals want housing. If you do the right model of housing with intensive services on site, individuals relish that and they embrace that. Not that they don't have challenges, because one of the biggest processes that we go through is it takes a few months, because as people move into housing, they're having to unlearn the survival skills that they learn to survive on the street and learn all the activities of daily living that you and I know well. How do you cook a meal? How do you clean your apartment? How do you shop for food? How do you stay on a budget? So that's the broader model, and it's worked time and time and time again in communities just like Asheville. Not only across the country, but Step Up has done many of these projects that are very successful and in housing the individuals who are the most challenging. So the model that we'll have in Asheville is replicated in every other project that we do. If it's a 100-unit project, we have two components of what we do. We have supportive services and property management. So the supportive services, and that's what Nikki talked about, is the $1.5 million commitment. We'll underwrite the support staff that will be on site. We'll have one full-time staff for every 25 residents. So we'll have at least 4 staff on site. And their 100% of their job will be working day to day with all the tenants on an individual basis. They'll be working with the tenants through that initial challenging period when they're adapting to their housing. You know, I have to tell you, in our experience, when you've been living on the street for years, it's not uncommon when somebody moves into housing that it actually takes them about a year to start sleeping in their bed. Think about that for a second. That seems so, doesn't make sense, but when you've been used to sleeping outside, that's what you're used to when you've been doing it for years. So it really does take quite a while to adapt. A lot of people congregate all their belongings in one small area because that's the way they can stay safe on the street and make sure they're not stolen. So this is what we do with each individual as they progress, is to help them understand you are safe. You can sleep in the bed. Here's how you clean. You don't, we had one woman who moved in and she was getting up at 6:30 every morning and going to the bus stop. And when we talked with her about why she was doing it, she said, well, when I was living in a shelter, we had to get out every morning and had to do something. We couldn't stay in the shelter. So I just got used to doing that. And we said, you know what? You can actually sleep in the morning. You don't have to get up so early and get out. This is your place. You can choose what you want. So the supportive services staff are working intensively with each tenant on a day-to-day basis to see how they're doing, to help them with any challenges they have, monitoring. And what we're really trying to do is create a sense of community. Now that we're addressing those physiological needs that's on the ground level, we're starting to address some of the psychological needs and to create a sense of connection of them with us and of the different tenants with each other. So, and as people stabilize, which is usually within 3 to 6 months, then the role of our staff on site is to help connect each tenant to outside things that are going to enrich their life, that bring them up to that middle tier of a sense of belonging. Is it taking classes? Is it a part-time job? Is it volunteer work? What is it that is going to connect you to other people and have meaning in your life and give you that greater sense of belonging? So that's and that's going to include outside organizations as well. So we know a lot of homeless people are connected to multiple organizations in Nashville. So the staff on site are going to work with each organization so that everyone's working in coordination to help that individual achieve their goals. And we know those goals will change over time. So that's the supportive services component. The second component is property management. So we will have 2 live-in resident managers who handle the property management function. They'll be there living full-time. They'll be the eyes and the ears 24/7 of the property, and they do the typical property management functions, collect the rent, take care of maintenance, but they're also part of the solution because property management and services will work together in combination to the benefit of each tenant, but just from a different perspective. So this 2-legged stool is enhanced with a 3rd leg of outside supportive services agencies that the individuals are already engaged with. So the 3-legged stool of supportive services, property management, and outside service organizations really provide a rich supportive environment. And since we're there every single day as eyes and ears, we can address any issues early and resolve them. But I have to tell you that in my experience, the biggest issues come from not the tenants, but guests of tenants. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing is from an architectural standpoint, putting cameras, address security, try and control access onto the property so that our staff can monitor who's coming in and who's not. We, of course, want the tenant staff guests, but we want to make sure that they're not going to cause a problem. So we do lots of things to address that. We're going to work with local police. So we've done this time and time again. And what happens is these apartment buildings, because the motel will become 100 studio apartments, and it will become an apartment building. And these individuals will rise to that 3rd level of belonging and be engaged in the community in new ways than when they were homeless. You know, I know that there have been complaints sometimes that people say, oh, your tenants are going to the bathroom in the alleyway, or they're congregating, they're loitering somewhere. And almost all the time, it doesn't tend to be our tenants. It tends to be other homeless individuals that get associated. So we do a lot to reduce any non-tenants coming to a project. That's why we never have services on site for non-tenants. This is an apartment building, and over time, it becomes transparent to the community. And it's just a great looking building that is just another apartment building. Oh, and by the way, since it's not a motel, you don't have the continual going in and coming out. It'll reduce congestion because these are now residents. One other thing I want to address is I know there's been an article circulating that was about Step Up from a couple years back about one of our projects. And there's a lot of misinformation about that, but it didn't shine a very positive light on that particular project. And I just want to say that project was, I mean, about the myriad of wonderful articles about our organization. In fact, Steve Lopez of the LA Times, who wrote the book The Soloist that became the movie with Jamie Foxx about a mentally ill individual, he wrote a front page article about the Vine project that I talked about because it was a home to John Germain, who was homeless for 30 years in Beverly Hills until he moved into this housing project. He moved into it in 2013, and he's still there today, and he's stably housed. But this one negative article was really about partners that we had partnered with and some of their actions that had taken place before we came into the partnership and really got involved. And when we found out what those things were, we ejected them from the partnership and really felt like victims ourselves. And then Shangri-La and Step Up as a deep partnership took over the projects completely. And That project is scheduled to open in about a month. So I know there's some misinformation. I'd be happy to clarify that if people have specific questions, but I want to reassure you there are hundreds of positive stories, and we have numerous buildings that are highly integrated in the community. And in fact, the principal from the preschool next door to the Vine building was willing to talk to another principal in another area near where a building we were going to site. That's how much they endorse what we do. So I know that's a lot of information, but I want to assure you that Step Up is committed to being a good neighbor in Asheville. We're committed to being transparent and listening and incorporating input, but also bringing this tried and true model of a 97% retention rate of those who are most challenging in your community when they're on the street, in a way that they'll succeed. In this particular project, as Nikki talked about, half are going to be veterans and half are going to be chronically homeless individuals. So we'll also work with the VA staff. There'll be VA staff on site as well as Step Up staff in ensuring that every tenant has the best hope of not only stabilizing in these units, but also rising to that third level of Maslow's hierarchy of feeling a sense of belonging in the community. Because we know once they pass that first year of stability, the likelihood of their staying long-term is very, very likely. And we also know, as Brian talked about, that their interaction once they're housed with law enforcement, with 911, with going to the ER for their health issues, with involvement in the courts, all that historically in every one of our projects goes way down over time. After the first year, you see a tremendous drop in all those interactions with the most expensive government systems of care that are really crisis-related systems, because people stabilize and they don't need that help anymore.
Great.
Nikki, I'll turn it back to you.
Excellent. And I just want to say thank you for sharing that information. It's really great to hear about your work and your approach. So I appreciate you sharing that information. I just think one more thing that I wanted to share, because it was a question that I fielded earlier today and wanted to make sure that we cover, is really about the timing and how quickly this came about. And it certainly has been quick, but as what I understand, and Brian really has been our point person here, but I understood that both Shangri-La and Step Up had looked to site a project in Asheville for some time and had been looking to, at different hotels in the area to understand where there could be a good fit. But quite frankly, when the city became, had the understanding that the emergency shelter was not going to proceed at this location, we were able to connect the dots, right? And connect Step Up to this opportunity, Shangri-La to this Step Up to this opportunity to see if we had something here. And so we're fortunate that timing has worked out, and we hope that that we can see some positive results come before City Council next week.
And Nikki, maybe I should just address the timing of the project too, in terms of concrete details. So if we're able to negotiate the transfer of that contract, and we're engaged with the owner right now, then we will probably close on the project in February or so. And there are about 50 individuals living in a shelter basis in the units. They will stay there, and we'll move them. The motel is 2 separate physical buildings. So we'll move all those individuals that are staying there now into one building. Shangri-La will rehab the vacant building, and that would probably take 6 to 8 months or so. And then once all those units are rehabbed, those individuals in the other building will become residents of those units. And then we'll rehab the other building, the vacant building. And that will take another 6 to 8 months. And then the veteran tenants will all move into those buildings. So the first benchmark should be acquire the property in February or so. By the fall, late fall, we should be opening the first building for those individuals to move in. And then by probably early summer or so, the second building will be complete, and then the veteran tenants will move into that.
Excellent. So I hope that information has been helpful to really share out to our listeners and our community today. And so I think at this point, We are ready to open the floor for questions. We have some email questions that we have that I know Ashley is going to help us with. And I know we have a caller queue. So I think, Ashley, if I'll turn it over to you and you can lay our ground rules here, and then we can start with the live questions.
Thank you, Nikki. So for everyone who's on the line, we're going to ask that people still follow those same council rules of decorum. Just a reminder, if you're listening in and you want to be heard, so please call 855-925-2801. When prompted for this meeting, the code is 4928. Once again, the code is 4928. And then you would hit the *3 and you'll enter the speaker queue. I'm going to go ahead and start first with our callers who've been on the line, and then we'll work our way through the comments that we've received. Stand by, Nikki. Our first caller ending 2266, your line is open.
Grant Millen, and I'm running for city council. And my first college paper was on homelessness. I worked in commercial photography, motion picture production for 17 years, and I researched a documentary on the war on drugs, and worked with a harm reduction specialist many years ago. I'm not saying I'm an expert on these things, but I'm aware. I actually just became aware that it's over half of our homeless population are veterans. I'm an honorably discharged veteran. So I'm glad we saved this idea of the opportunity of securing the East Asheville Residence Inn, because it was on the rocks. It looked like it was not going to work. And I want to say, just heard everybody's perspective, but maybe some colors. I want to say that the residents, the neighbors in the vicinity of that residence inn, they're not just experiencing some kind of panic, unreasonable panic or NIMBYism. I had to help them use the APD Simplicity database to understand that APD calls for service rose over 100% in that area, a 1 mile radius of that residence inn over the past 10 years. And that's just data. And a lot of it is concerning. There's overdoses and death investigations. The death investigations have to be rectified through the buncombe medical examiners. And we aren't there yet. We aren't understanding crime, public safety, and public health in a really in-depth way yet. Mayor Mannheimer, in talking about this just this week in the Citizen Times, she said, we need a study. And I'm calling it the Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Wellness Study, that it isn't just going to be Step Up or Shangri-La's perspective on what the best practices are for. I have a lot of business background, and we talk about strategy as out of control or control, and it's not controlling people. It's not about one race being in control of someone else, but we aren't going to have a city that's experiencing what the West Coast is experiencing. I was born in San Francisco, and when the gentleman with Step Up references Los Angeles, it's well known that Los Angeles has an expansive homelessness problem, and the whole nation is going to be coming together. And so our study of our challenges back